example, in South America, it is customary to honor diplomatic asylum in a way that is arised by custom, not by treaty.
But customary law says there are certain principles that are so fundamental in society that regardless of your religion, regardless of your nationality, regardless of your ethnicity, you think these things are right. Let me ask you this.
It's natural laws.
Is that?
Natural laws.
Natural laws. It's similar to the idea of natural laws. It's called customary law. So let me ask you this. What do you think would happen if somebody, let's just say the U.S. decided to prosecute the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or Colombia or someplace by moving in and killing all the women from the age of 6 to 14? Huh? That's wrong, right? Everybody would say it's wrong, right? That's customary law. And the idea behind customary law is that it's customary law. It doesn't matter whether you sign an agreement. It doesn't matter whether you sign a treaty. You're still bound by it. Was customary law used in the Nuremberg trials?
Probably.
Absolutely. We tried German jurists, German judges, for enforcing law, which was black letter. Do you know what I mean by black letter law? Black letter law is law that was written out in black and white letters and approved. You know, it's the kind of law you can find in a book, right? As opposed to customary law. So we prosecuted judges for enforcing black letter law in Germany because that law was a violation of customary law. So it's really important, and it affects everybody. Now, if we look at the big picture of international law, you have international law, you have customary law, and fundamentally, international law is based on customary law. And then you have public law and private law. Private law is between an individual and a state, between individuals across states, that kind of stuff. Public law is what affects states, whole states, state governments, the nations. And then you have, when you break it down, you break it into international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Maybe you know the difference? All you vets? International humanitarian law is a little complicated at first. International humanitarian law is the law that governs armed conflict. Armed conflict. Internal, external, international, within its thing.
Who had a Geneva Convention card in Vietnam?
Who was in Vietnam without a Geneva Convention card? Unless you threw it away. Which is part of the whole problem. Anyway, so Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, Nuremberg Principles are all part of international humanitarian law. International human rights law is outside of the conflict. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, etc., a whole bunch of them. And these are treaties. Interestingly enough, these can be suspended.
Yeah, don't shut the door locked.
Curiously, these can be suspended. These cannot be suspended.
You like over here.
Any questions?
Suspended by whom?
These can be suspended because you have extreme situations. A tsunami, a war, they can be suspended. These can't be because they deal in extreme situations. Curious, anyway. Okay.
That's a good question, though. Who suspends them?
Yeah, international law is complicated. Who does suspend them? Well, there isn't a cut and dry answer. A nation might say, no, you can't sue us. You can't prosecute us for that because we were in the middle of a national disaster, and we just couldn't deal with human rights.
Well, how about an internal armed conflict?
That didn't happen in this country, did it?
What?
That didn't happen in this country, did it?
It's a civil war.
They didn't have any human rights then.
They already suspended it. Okay. Does that answer that question? Okay, so prosecution is a complicated process. So let me just step ahead. Prosecution is a complicated process. If we're in the middle of a war, what am I going to say to him? I'm charging your soldier XYZ for. He did commit an international crime, right? So that's a complicated problem. So what we've done is, so what they did is they did a couple of things. One is they came up with this idea of universal jurisdiction. What does that mean? Go for it. Ron. Oh. They said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to say this. These two guys are in a fight. And we know they're committing war crimes. Look at Israel-Palestine. We know they're both committing war crimes. We know they can't prosecute each other. It just isn't going to work. What we say is every single nation, Ron over here, who's got no dog in our fight, neither one of us are a part of his nation. It's not happening in this nation. It didn't happen in this nation. He does not involve in it. But because of universal jurisdiction, he has jurisdiction to prosecute. Right? Kind of a clever idea. Tricky legally. A lot of issues here. One of the things that's fascinating about international human rights law in general is, it's not very old. 1907 was the first Hague Agreement. Oh, incidentally, speaking of that, where did the law, where did the code come from for the 1907 Hague Agreement? No, for the 1899 Hague Agreement, which was the first establishment writing down black letter of the laws of land warfare. Where'd that come from? Anybody have any idea? Yes.
Well, I know why the conference happened. Shall I give that?
Please, but do it more loudly.
So, one of the main funders of the conference was the Tsar of Russia. And the reason why he wanted it is one of his aides, a Jewish banker from Poland named Jan Bloch, wrote a book, about 5 volumes, on why war wouldn't work anymore because of machine guns. And that theory worked out in 1914. And the reason why Jan Bloch wrote that partially is because he was Jewish, and he predicted that if there was a war in Russia, there would be pogroms, and the Jewish population would suffer. He wrote this in 1894, and was proved correct in 2005 when the unsuccessful revolution led to a lot of pogroms against Jews. But basically what he told the Tsar was, if you have a war, there's going to be a revolution, and the Tsardom will come to an end, which is what happened. But so, thinking ahead, the Tsar was a big fan and proponent of the 1899 Hague Conference. That's one reading I've seen.
Okay, so one thing I want to take out of that too is we talk about conventions. We're not talking about conferences. We'll talk about conventions as in agreements. In international law, conventions usually refer to agreements. So the 1949 Geneva Conference had four conventions came out of it. But, so let me say one thing. Have you heard of the Lieber Code?
Who?
The Lieber Code? Civil War? This is interesting history, this is an aside. So the Lieber Code was written by Lieber, Lincoln brought it out. It was the first time the laws of land warfare were written down in black letter law. U.S. Civil War. And it was used almost directly in the 1899 Hague Conference. How did I get there?
Conferences versus conventions.
That was your point. How did these conventions come about?
Right, okay, so, let me go on. Let's see, so why do we give a damn about international law?
Good question.
Why do you care about international law, or don't you?
No, I think we absolutely need something that governs interactions between states, and the whole issue of kind of universal jurisdiction. We have an interest, moral interest in what happens within states when it goes beyond certain limits.
So how does it apply to us on the ground in the United States? Yes?
Well, I think the question might also be, do our leaders care about international human rights law?
I'm gonna tell you about our leaders. They care if we make them.
Well, I'll go along with that. Let's make them.
But what about,
Here.
what about the judiciary who won't even hear an argument of international law?
Thank you.
And we have 3 people from Oak Ridge who were not even allowed to argue why they walked onto that nuclear bomb plant. And they're now in prison for 3 to 5 years.
Right.
They were even
Okay.
lectured about how they could properly address their problems. Alleged insult.
Right, that'll work well. So I wanna talk about, so that's great, a really good point. And later on, I'm gonna talk about why it is part of our law. But right now, I wanna talk about why it affects us. So this is a good point. How does it affect us, you and I? It affects you and I in a lot of ways. It affects us in our resistance. Why? Because if I go to court for trespassing, discon, incommoding, that's the one in DC, I love that one, in DC, whatever it is.
Ingress or egress.
Aggravated blocking of the traffic. Anyway, whatever they call those various things. If I can go in with the international law, right, and I go on to the Nuremberg Principles, the Nuremberg Principles give me either what they sometimes call a Nuremberg privilege, sometimes call a Nuremberg obligation, which says that I am legally responsible for any complicity that I have in war crimes. How many people have paid taxes? And those taxes were used for war crimes.
That's right.
What if we did work crimes? We do.
What's that?
What if we did work crimes?
What if we did war crimes? I'm not even going there, bro. I know about that one. So my point being, but my point being is that our government's complicit in war crimes. If we aren't trying to block them by Nuremberg, we are essentially guilty. We are guilty. We are triable. That's what happened in Germany. There were 1,600 people tried in the Nuremberg trials in Germany, 5,700 tried in the Tokyo trials. And one of the key pieces of Nuremberg was to say that you have to come on through the line. You have to try individuals for commission of war crimes because you can't try some amorphous theoretical thing like a government. That was Jackson's. So, why do we care about Nuremberg? Why do we care that international law is enforced in our local courts? Because if we get stopped for protesting, what do you want to protest? Drones, war. What do you want to pick? Pick one.
Weaponized uranium.
Weaponized uranium. If we want to protest the fact that weaponized uranium, a bomb is illegal by international law. It is obviously an indiscriminate weapon, right? It's as indiscriminate as you can freaking get. So if we want to protest that, we get arrested for trespassing. We say, hey, if we have international law, if we can bring that into the court, central to our case, absolutely central to our case is weaponized uranium a war crime? That's central to our case, because if it is a war crime, we're using our Nuremberg privilege, and therefore we're innocent. Right? And then here's another thing too. Have you ever seen an unjust law in this country?
Yeah, what?
Have you ever seen a law that was unjust? Have you ever seen a law that violated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yeah, I lived in Memphis in the 50s.
What's that?
I said I lived in Memphis in the 50s.
And even now too. If we were enforcing international law in local courts, we could take these laws that get passed, which are really wrong, and we could put them up against the measure of the International Declaration of Human Rights in a local court. And if we were enforcing international law in local courts, we could prosecute war criminals. I don't know if we have any around. I'm not talking about you guys like you and I. And in fact, Jackson in the Nuremberg trials said it's really important that we don't try the little guys. He said that doesn't do any good. You got to try the big guys who made the decisions. And if you look at Nuremberg, that's what they did. They went after the big guys. So if we can get international, if we can have international law enforced in local courts, we can prosecute our war criminals, our presidents.
Yes.
And you know, one of the problems we have is that they can control the federal courts, you know, a few federal judges. But what would happen if we got out there and we got maybe 1% of all the local courts to swear out a warrant for Bush? Or what if it wasn't even 1%? What if it was only 1,000 of them? Driving on through, excuse me, sir, we have to get off the thruway because the next town has a warrant out for you. Excuse me, sir, we got to back up. Yes?
So, for me, in my approach, I find it productive to look at the evolution of these things and to actually look at a little bit brief history, the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Convention. And you mentioned verbally, but you didn't write down the 1927 Kellogg-Briand Treaty
Right.
that makes war illegal. Because for me, as an amateur historian, I see this as an optimistic picture. So the Geneva Conventions began in around 1860 when this European guy, Solferino, saw a battlefield full of dying men who could still be saved. And out of that came the Red Cross and the various Geneva Conventions. Well, it's a story in hypocrisy because a lot of European royalty was donating their jewelry to support the Geneva Convention at first. It was nonetheless a step forward. My big critique of the American peace movement in relation to international law is we call on it when we want it, sort of like some rich uncle, but we ignore it otherwise. And we're surprised why it isn't there for us. Now, when I traveled through Europe, I saw a culture where people took international law more seriously and actually helped form a European Union, which didn't have international law but has regional law. And I would like to see us start talking in that direction. I was very, very influenced in 1989 when I read the book Planethood by one of the Nuremberg prosecutors.
So I think, let me go to another part, which is this whole question of enforcement. Basically, international law is enforced in domestic courts. They've always balked at some kind of an overall power. So it's been left to domestic courts. So I'll be with you 1 second. Who's responsible for international law being enforced in our courts? I used one word just before courts, in our courts.
We are.
Who said that? You? Why do you say that?
It seemed like that's where you were leading.
Okay, anybody else? Yes?
I think that's right. I think that it's left to the individual because there's a distinct separation between government and the people in every country in the world, no matter what their political philosophy or structure is. And they leave the onus up to citizens to do the things that they won't do on their own because of the threat that will pose to them.
That's right. How many people believe we have a democracy? No. How many people want a democracy? Is somebody going to give you a democracy?
No, you gotta.
Can somebody give you a democracy? Well, where does it come from then?
From us.
Exercise
From what?
From us.
From us?
Yeah.
We have the power?
Yes, we do.
Only if we use.
We are free South
Only if we
Koreans.
work in
What
unison
did Claire
together.
say?
Right, I said only if we use that power, and
Yeah.
we've gotten really complacent. Why?
And we've been talked out of our power.
Was that?
Individuals that were concerned about human rights in the country that Pinochet had control of, they were the ones that basically had to pursue him and get him into a Spanish court.
So the individuals who
Yeah.
you can come who got Pinochet.
Yeah, those countries that.
Hey, did you ever hear Frederick Douglass?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Remember he said, the limits on tyrants are prescribed by the patience of the oppressed.
Yes,
That's right.
Yes, sir, say that
So, where I'm going with this is this point of how's it going to be. Is that for us to sit here and cry in our beer? Anybody have beer? I missed that. For us to cry in our beer about international law not being enforced in this country is dodging the issue. It's not gonna happen unless we make it. That's the way it's gonna happen.
We're not even members of the World Court.
What's that?
The US isn't even a member of the World Court, I thought.
But we don't have to do it in the World Court. International law is usually enforced in domestic courts. We could be trying our war criminals right now. And in fact, we could be trying them on domestic law too, because we have a whole bunch of domestic laws that they're violating, but that's another issue, because very often our domestic law reflects international law, because that's part of the enforcement mechanism, is that you pass domestic laws that reflect the international law so that you have a mechanism for enforcing it. So, want to play a little bit of a game? Yes?
So, I was gonna ask you, but so how do we do it? How do we enforce that?
How do we make it happen?
How do we make it happen?
Okay, I think there's a couple of things. One, how do I put this? Okay, one thing is that international law requires governments during times of peace to educate the public about international law. What did you tell me about Europe? Who just told me about Europe? What did you tell me about? Didn't you say something about the way the Europeans have a different attitude towards international law than we do?
Yes,
What's the difference?
they take it seriously.
Can you hear him?
They all have a sense of it. You talk to somebody on a train and they're more likely to say, oh, but that's against international law.
Public perception, public's expectation. That's the biggest key thing, is public expectation. You know, I was in my last trial before Judge Gideon up in Hancock. I suddenly realized I had this moment, because I wasn't there. I was on the West Coast when the judgment was passed down. I had read his judgment before I went to sentencing, so I knew what he was going to say. And I thought, this is a moment. I have no case before this judge, so I don't have to worry about any ex parte communication. During sentencing, the tradition is they pretty much let you do whatever you want to do. You know, go ahead, do it. This is your time. It's not constricted by the usual descriptions of the usual constricts of the court. And I thought, this is an opportunity to engage the judge on how in the hell he's dodging this issue. How is he dodging the issue that international law applies here? You know what I got? First of all, he could stop the whole thing anyway, which means he said, I decided that before, I'm not going to decide again. He decided it totally wrong, but you're not going to decide it again. But the other thing, his answer, I said, look, we have 6 Supreme Court rulings where I gave you citations, six Supreme Court cases that say that you need to enforce this in your court. Can you tell me why you think you don't have to do it? You know what his answer was? You know what law is?
State court or federal?
This is state court. You know, I mean, this is town court.
Justice court, right? I mean,
Yeah, town justice.
was the judge even an attorney?
Actually, he is. He
They don't have to be.
No, they don't have to be. He's actually a clerk for some other judges. But anyway, he's pretty relatively good, better than most. Pretty much what you said before. You know what he said? I interpret the law differently than you do.
So that left you free to interpret the law for yourself, getting the burden down.
Right, while I was in jail. Richard?
Well, Elliott, you know as well as I do, you've been there, I've been there. They'll say, well, you can't bring up the Nuremberg, you can't bring up that,
Okay.
you can't bring up that, I don't accept it.
Okay, so I got two places to go right here. One is, do you want to go over why the legal groundwork for why it should be enforced in international court, or do you want to go a little bit of an arrest scenario thing? Which way do you want to go? Do you want to go into the legal train of why we would argue that international law should be enforced in local courts, like when we're being tried, and part of the case, and why it's part of international law? Or do you want to go into just a little bit of developing a defense case from arrest scenario?
Can I suggest a third way? Because I feel like you're arguing for harvesting fruit that's growing there naturally instead of setting up orchards. If we change American
Go ahead and
culture to be
explain what you
more
want to do, Ryan. I'm not catching your analogy.
If we change America to be more supportive of international law, as was the case in the late 1940s. So you mentioned Justice Jackson and also Justice William Douglas. Both were big supporters of international law through peace, but they're dead. And we can talk about their work and recreate that culture. That would be a third approach, which I assume we won't take today, but in the spirit of being idealistic, I wanted to mention that.
They're coming, they're coming.
Yeah, the black helicopters.
Elliott, can I just raise kind of a historical point? For whatever reason, American courts, even the highest, Supreme Courts in states, are prejudiced and reluctant to deal with international law, and it's perceived as hippy-dippy, loosey-goosey. And it may be just our American nationalism, it may be the American exceptionalism that no power other than God could be higher than a U.S. court. Because in the recent case where the U.S. Supreme Court said it was
I'm gonna pick up from there. I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the chain of law of why I argue that the international law has to be part of our law.
I'm just saying there's a prejudice against it.
Oh, there is.
Yes.
I'm gonna tell you something. I have never had any judge admit international law. Yeah. I'll tell you, the judge in Quantico put it perfectly. She said, I find you guilty of I think it was aggravated blocking of the traffic as charged. And as for those lofty ideas of international law, they have no place in my court. Right? What does the U.S. Constitution say? Constitution, and all treaties made which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and judges of every state shall be bound thereby, and anything in the Constitution laws that otherwise doesn't count.
That's right.
What's complicated?
It's very simple.
It's
So,
complicated.
do we really trust our courts and judiciary? Do we really still have faith in that? I for one do not.
I don't know anybody else, but I.
You can trust the court-appointed psychiatrist.
Support it too.
No,
Yeah.
I'd like an answer to her question.
Go.
That's my concern too.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. There's no justice in the House of Justice. There ain't anything like it. It's just not there.
Has the Supreme
One.
Court interpreted this article?
Yes.
And put it?
Yes.
put this to
I'll go to that next. Yeah. Yes.
I was just gonna ask, like, how many laws actually work? I mean,
Okay, I think-
slavery is, we have an amendment for that, but it's found now bigger than ever. If we have human trafficking, that's global,
Okay.
that's global.
Good. I'm gonna go to that. I will go to that issue next. Yes.
So the answer is we have to unite, and instead of doing a million-man march, we all have to we gotta recruit. We gotta recruit, and then we gotta go to Washington, and we gotta have 35 million people there and say, get the fuck out.
Okay. I think you're both right. Going back to your question about do we trust laws to be enforced? Let me tell you something. We have a billion laws in the books that aren't enforced. When I was mayor, I tried to get my board to go through the laws and get rid of these things. Because we have laws about horses and horses on blocking the sidewalk and stuff. And we had hundreds of years worth of laws. And if you have a myriad of laws that aren't in fact enforced but are on your books, it is the formula for prejudicial enforcement. Somebody's going to grab one of those old laws sometime and drag it up here and nail something. And it's just not fair. They wouldn't get rid of them. But here's the point. We have many laws on the books that do not get enforced, and we have laws that aren't on the books that do get enforced. What causes that? Why does that happen? Why? Let me ask you this. Why can we have a law on a book that doesn't get enforced? What happens?
You lose respect for the law pretty soon if you've got laws that are selectively enforced or.
Yeah, but I'm just asking, what's the mechanism? I'll give you my opinion. What's that?
People make money.
People make money? Here's what I would argue. There isn't the political will to enforce the law. There isn't the political will to enforce the law. If I'm a cop, if I'm a town board, I know perfectly well that I'm going to catch hell if that law is enforced. I'm not going to want my enforcement officers enforcing it. And that's the battle I had. I tried to get enforcement officers to enforce every law in the book because I knew damn well if the board was forced with them, they had a real human being who was being hurt by the law, they'd get rid of it. Right? But the enforcement officer wouldn't do it because it's a political position too, because he knew that the board would be mad at him. But anyway, here's the essence of it. And you know, I'll carry this one step further. When I was a young man, I believed our rights were guaranteed by a body of laws. The US Constitution, that's being enforced, isn't it? The Bill of Rights, that's being enforced.
Well, it depends on how you interpret it.
And all the presidents say we are a nation of laws.
A nation of law. Yes, and every court will tell you, every judge will tell you, they only use part of the phrase. They say the law is the law. And what they always leave off is the part which is not there, but is real, which is except for when it's not.
But you can't write a statute that applies to every situation. So therefore, you need a court interpretation of what the statute means in that particular situation.
That's a nuance I'm not even getting into. I'm talking about whole laws that don't get enforced. I've been arrested for driving cars barefoot. There's not a single state in the union that's got a law against driving barefoot. But I've been arrested for it. Because there's a public perception that that's the law. There's a public perception that you can't be barefoot in businesses. That's why they put signs on the thing, no barefoot, no shoes, no shirt, no surface. They believe they're following a law that doesn't exist. So it's all a question of public perception and public domain. That's what I believe. Same thing's true of international law. In Europe, they believe that international law should be enforced. In this country, we had a discussion about whether torture was legal. You know, I bet there's 6 or 7 or 8 or 10, I don't know how many treaties there are that says it's illegal. Treaties that specifically talk about waterboarding. I mean, there's just no question in international law what is true of both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It's illegal. It is illegal, point black letter law, but in this country we had a discussion about it because we didn't have the perception.
So has the Supreme Court interpreted Article
Yes.
6 to state that
So,
judges in state courts have jurisdiction over questions of international law?
In social, 2004, for 2 centuries, we have affirmed that the domestic law of the United States recognizes the law of nations.
That's not what I asked.
I'm telling you what the Supreme Court's ruled.
Okay, so they have not ruled about a state court having jurisdiction to settle cases of international law,
Right here. What's domestic law?
not international law. My question is a
Domestic
state court?
Domestic law is domestic law.
Right, I'm asking whether a state court has jurisdiction to hear a case on international law, which is what you said before, and what Article 6 seems to state.
Right here.
Ellie, what's the Mexican, what's the recent US Supreme Court where the Mexican citizens have a right to consult with the consul? And that's an example of where they're forcing the Texas courts to recognize that you have that right.
Well, there's a whole bunch of rulings,
That's a
and of
reason.
course, nothing, courts don't make big blanket statements, they do things like this. Well, this is a big blanket statement, this is a stunning statement.
You can't interpret that without knowing the context in which it's being used, which means you have to read the whole opinion. You just cannot pull a phrase out of context and say that is the law. It's only how it is applied that it makes any difference.
Have you ever?
What was the situation there where the Supreme Court applied that?
Have you ever read? Let me just interrupt you. Have you ever read a legal brief?
Yeah, sure, I'm a lawyer.
This is exactly what you
Are you a
do.
lawyer?
This is
I'm a
exactly
lawyer
what you do.
too.
You give the citation.
Yes or no question, and
You
that's an answer.
you take
No,
a.
it doesn't. Yes, it does.
It's
not that simple.
Yes, it is. At the top last one's lawyers, and I had some.
It's that simple.
Has the Supreme Court interpreted Article 6?
Let's hold on.
I don't remember. It's been 30 years since last one.
Let's hold on. I'm gonna give you a couple of others. No, the Supreme Court has never interpreted Article 6 as just saying Article 6, because they can't do that. They can only do it in the case of an actual case. They can't do theoretical cases. Okay,
Okay, so it hasn't been.
here's one. It is, of course, true that the United States applies international law as part of our own in appropriate circumstances.
In appropriate circumstances, there you go. It's your exculpatory.
Well, there's always a law. Okay. This was in
Way back.
1900.
Before that.
Well, this is a very important case. International law is part of our, I think this is 1900, sorry, I don't have the citation here. International law is part of our law and must be ascertained and administered by the courts of justice of appropriate jurisdiction as often as questions of right depending upon it are duly presented for their determination.
Appropriate jurisdiction might be the tricky phrase.
But they've got it, they can't just say, they couldn't say you have to, unless, because that wouldn't make sense either. They couldn't just say they have to always enforce it, because maybe it doesn't apply.
So part of the thing, part of the thing that's necessary in a case is to prove that it applies. Is that part of the situation?
Sure.
I'm gonna tell you something, no it's not.
Okay,
There is not a judge who is, I said this before, there is not a judge or a lawyer who has given me a single, or one single argument for why these don't apply. The court is bound by the law of nations, which is part of the law of our land. And this is really important. I really want to bring this out to them. One of the things really important to understand is international law is not a separate law.
Yeah.
Go back to the Constitution. Shall be the supreme law of the land.
Yeah.
And judges of every state as part of our law. To enforce domestic law, local law, to enforce local law without incorporating international law is exactly the same as trying to enforce domestic law without enforcing constitutional law.
Where do you get your precedent for international law? I mean, you can't just say that's what international law is. You gotta have some basis for
Oh, absolutely.
what that law is.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, whether it be something from the United Nations or something like treaty of a number of nations.
Absolutely. So did you all hear what he's saying?
Yeah.
So you could say that international law applies, but then you have to interpret the international law.
We don't, but the recent Supreme Court case said there's a treaty between U.S. and Mexico that says Mexican nationals who are arrested have a right to meet with the Mexican consul. That was not followed. So in death row cases, we had inmates who confessed, et cetera, got sentenced to the death penalty, and they raised, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, we will enforce that treaty. State of Texas, you must, that's a defense. I mean, that was clear, and that was a particular law. So there was a treaty right, a Mexican citizen has a treaty right to see the consul before any other question.
There's a myriad of the Supreme Court rulings saying it's part of the law. In Texas, it says.
Well, you got an understanding in that situation of what the international law is. Well, I mean,
Right.
it's clear.
It was specific.
It's very specific. Very
Right,
specific.
that is a specific treaty.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll go a little bit more into that. Okay, but here's another one. Let's see, international disputes implicating our relations with foreign nations are one of the narrow areas in which federal common laws continues to exist. Not a good illustration. We do not deem it necessary, these are all Supreme Court rulings. We do not deem it necessary to consider the constitutional limits of treaty-making powers. A treaty within those limits by the express words of the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, binding alike nation and states courts, and is capable of enforcement and must be enforced.
What's your best quote yet?
And I want to go further. Not only does the Supreme Court rule it, let me just turn to the Army Field Manual of laws of land warfare. And you can also go to the Air Force one. Let's see, in chapter 1, section 1, 4B, force of treaties, under the Constitution, under the Constitution, the United States, treaties constitute part of the supreme law of the land, Article 6, Clause 2. In consequence, treaties related to the law of war have force equal to that of laws enacted by Congress. Their provisions must be observed by both military and civilian personnel with the same strict regard for both the letter and the spirit of the law, which is required with respect to the Constitution and the statutes enacted pursuant thereof. That's the U.S. Army. Remember that? I mean, we all know.
Oh, I carried that by heart.
Yeah, but we all know we were charged with complying with Geneva Conventions. At the same time, we were following orders that.
And this misstates the law because it implies that an act of Congress could override a treaty, which it can't. I mean, a treaty is superior to a law enacted by Congress.
But but they don't follow these laws.
Thank
you.
They don't
Well,
enforce
obvious.
these
That's
laws.
right.
So what are we to do? Are we to just futilely go throwing ourselves on, in front of the court and pleading something that they're not even willing to enforce?
I think it comes back to what I think you said and you said, which is, it's a matter of our getting familiar with the law, so we understand it, demanding, building the expectation in the American public that it will be enforced. I told you about my talking to Gideon, Judge Gideon, about in my sentencing statement, trying to engage him on the law. And I walked out of the court and realized, I'm never going to win in this court. I'm not going to get where I want to go. What I need to go is go to the people who elect him and build a public perception, not a perception, an understanding of how important these laws are for us and how they are the law and they need to be enforced. And if the public demands it of him, just like the horse laws, just like the shoe laws, all these laws which are borderline of either being enforced and they aren't the law or aren't being enforced and they are the law because of public support for it. Yes.
I'm going back to maybe some of the questions that were asked here. When we have a treaty, we actually end up with some of the, particularly some of the commercial treaties. We are enforcing fairly bizarre things that even seeds stuff to international business groups to settle trade disputes. We abrogate our, but that's all spelled out in detail, just like the issue you raised with Mexican prisoners. We also have international conventions that are accepted, of which we've refused to sign, like the one on using mines and things like that. You can say that's internationally accepted with the exception of 5 or 6 countries. What I'm asking is, in which cases do you have those kinds of principles that are not vaguely accepted because they're part of the general body of international law, but are accepted where the words in black and white have been accepted by the 2/3 members of the Senate to give them the same weight as these bizarre business treaties?
So I understand you're talking about ratification of treaties. That's the 2/3. I'm not quite sure what and I understand that there are lots of, going back to the private law, there's lots of stuff that the corporations are doing, laws that are being enforced about the corporations, laws that are being enforced against us under the NAFTA, and will soon be under the Pacific. Some of the WTO stuff. I understand that, but I'm not quite sure what your question is.
I think what I'm saying is we've got a body of international law that you describe generally. I think I'm asking you to define what elements of international law have been ratified by the 2/3 of Congress in the same way those treaties have versus being a general category of international law.
Okay,
that
so there's,
people can pick and choose from.
okay,
That's
so
what I'm
I need to
asking.
say something.
Does that make sense?
Customary law has the same validity as black and white ratified treaties. They do.
Okay.
So that's important to understand. And that's why we were able to try Germans. There were 13 trials in Nuremberg. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little strained here. So, losing my train of thought here. So that there's a black and white, there's black letter law and there's the customary law. They're both very, very important. We are certainly enforcing some portions and not enforcing other portions. There's lots of black letter law and international humanitarian law we aren't enforcing. We did it. You have had?
Yeah.
Non?
No.
How many people were not? Legally required to follow the Geneva Conventions, or international law. You just saw what the manual says. Army field manual says. We were given we were faced with a choice. Do you follow what I express is, do you follow the big laws and small laws, which is the same choice I say judges are faced with today in the courts. Do you follow the big law or the small? The law that saves millions of lives or the laws that affects a few people? Was I going to follow? And I can tell you what I did. I did not follow the Geneva Conventions. I followed the little laws. The little laws like the rules of engagement and the direct orders of my commanders. And they were illegal laws. And I was not only violating international law, I was violating the UCMJ. Because the UCMJ charges me with not following an unlawful law order, an unlawful order is an order that violates the Supreme Court, which is violating international law. Did everybody read this? I don't remember what I got on that line here. So,
What are we gonna do about it?
okay, I'm willing to go there. What do we do about it? What do we do? Yes.
Well, one comment was made, we gotta mobilize millions of people, but to me, it seems that we really have to reach out across the partisan divide and find common ground with those with whom we don't agree, and we have a lot of common discourse and public deliberations to do with regards to where we're at and what our common values are.
So I got a couple questions. How do you get 1 million people out there?
Yeah.
Locally, you gotta mobilize locally, you gotta start local.
Start local.
Yeah.
But you gotta have an issue that mobilizes, that 1 million people will mobilize.
An issue. Okay, so what gets, so you gotta figure out how we get, how many people know Margaret Mead's quote?
Do what?
Margaret Mead's quote, most famous
A
quote?
handful of people can mobilize the world.
Yeah, somebody got it?
Yeah.
Never doubt that a few dedicated individuals can't change the world. Change the world. It could be change the world.
It's the only thing that
Make a
ever
difference,
has.
but, indeed, it's the only way that it's ever happened. And of course, she was not spouting some theoretical, nice idea. She was spouting a law of physics. Everything starts from one person. Everything starts from one person. And then you gotta build it. And the first thing we have to do is get familiar with international law, get committed to it, get ready to do the arguments, recognize that the chain of law. I mean, how can you argue with this stuff? Supreme Court ruling after Supreme Court ruling says it's the case.
But
And
you've
nobody
gotta
did-
be willing to go down and pay the consequences when they don't adhere to the international law and they charge you on the lower law and send you away.
Right.
So that one person stepping forward, or that two, or that three, we've got a whole phalange of people that are gonna go down and do hard time before people start waking up.
And sometimes it's not a hard time. I did 10 days last time.
Well, we've got people in for 5 years
Right.
now here in Oak Ridge.
Right. They're doing hard time. Yes. But I'm just trying to say is that you don't have to do 5 years. You can do, I did 10 days the last time. Yes and then yes.
Margaret Mead also has another quote that's similar to, I remember Buckminster Fuller's quote rather more. He said, if you want to change things, you don't fight the existing reality, you build a new model that makes the old model obsolete.
That's right.
So that's why I was bringing up the idea, do laws actually work? And if they don't, why would you make more laws?
Oh, I think, can I interpret?
That's for times, that's
She's talking about.
that's for times
a
of
revolution.
measures.
I believe
And in the
That's
whole
how
world, the
revolution
globe,
works.
not just this country, is suffering environmentally, politically, economically, the whole 9 yards.
So I don't have any problem with the idea of changing the whole system, but I also think we can work to change pieces of it. And of course, I'm sort of speaking, you're a lawyer, you speaking as a lawyer, I've got many years in elected public office as a politician. So I sort of look at the system and think it can be made to work if people make it work. I think it would work if people make it work. If people demanded that the government serve them, demanded it, then I believe it will happen. If we don't demand it, I can guarantee it won't
What were
happen.
you charged with? It was a violation of a order of protection?
No, I have not been charged with a violation of order of protection. I haven't. I've in Hancock, I've been charged with trespassing, discon, OGA. Those are the only 3 charges I've been charged with.
So you weren't caught up in that scenario?
No.
In response to your question of how might we engage these kinds of changes that I imagine the majority of us in this room are seeking, I'm a huge fan of Buckminster Fuller, and I had the good fortune when I was 12 to spend 2 days with him. And Bucky coached us to look for the trim tab. The part, if on huge ships, you've got a rudder on the rudder, and that rudder, on that tiny little rudder on the bigger rudder chain moves the whole ship. Now, most people that want to talk about Buckminster Fuller and looking for the trim tab or those elements, to me, also miss his non-resistance. In the latter part of his life, he, from my understanding, made a policy of never disagreeing with anybody, which is an interesting idea. He didn't always do it, but that was, occasionally he spoke out harshly, but that was rare. But some of the other things that I look at is how people manage meaning. I get heartened presently in Thailand how protesters are reading 1984 in public. And so reading the book 1984 in public has become, has taken on new meaning. I used to, a model in my mind is also Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. He, after World War II, was seeking how he could be effective. And he had made propaganda films in World War II and then sought to affect more people post-World War II. And he thought that the best way to get his ecological values out to more people was to find stories that kids could identify with. With the work I used to do in advertising, it's a lot about meaning, which, like what they're doing now in Thailand with making the book 1984 and reading in public have a new meaning. We don't often look for those kinds of meanings in these kinds of things. It's like the way that women got the right to vote in the United States. Edward Bernays, I've got major qualms with him, but he got women the right to the vote at the same time he got women to smoke. The incidence of women smoking in the United States in the year that they got suffrage was less than 5%. And he got women on an Easter Day parade to a group of debutantes to in front of this judge's thing to break out cigarettes and smoke and called them torches of liberty and passed out press releases. And within 90 days, the incidence of women having tried a cigarette in the United States was at, I read, 27%. So in 90 days, he got this, he mobilized women to smoke in public because smoking in public meant to women their right to vote.
He's the father of propaganda.
He wrote the book Propaganda. The word propaganda was coined by somebody in the Catholic Church as a peace movement. The idea was written as an economics treaty to a pope to explain how education was more cost effective than holy wars. That's where the word propaganda came from, the Sacred Dia de Propaganda in the late 17th century. I'm an amateur historian on communication, so to me, coming up with some sort of meaning where there's something like that 1984, there's something like that torch, I don't know what it is, but I often feel as though the peace movement lacks that kind of creating some sort of meaning.
Let me interrupt the conversation. I have some handouts which include a bunch of the international laws. It'll include a memo in support of an in limine motion. So that's a lawyer's statements about why this should be allowed in the court and why it's relevant to the case. It happened to do with the case drones, I think, and some other stuff. So if you get your email to me, I'll send that out. There's some stuff on the Nuremberg principles. I want to talk a little bit about the Nuremberg principles. How much time do we have? We really don't have many. Any burning questions? Is that
3:58. Got half an hour.
Nuremberg.
Oh, I got half an hour. Oh, cool. Okay, great.
But only if you talk fast.
In which case nobody will understand. So do we want to talk more about how we create this change? I think it's a really important issue. I think it's a burning issue. So you were saying, and you were saying you need to figure out a hook, what we call a hook, which is kind of what you were saying. We need to start. In other words, it's got to start somewhere. It's like the old saying,
started.
If,
Well,
if not me, who, if not me, who, if not now, when?
Would you give a little talk, so, I mean, we have this theory, and the judges won't do it, so maybe tell a war story about trying a case and the testimony you wanted to elicit that wasn't admitted.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, so what's it like when you try to apply the racist, you're saying we have this defense, you try to raise this defense in court, and the judge says this just doesn't apply in the story here.
I have never gotten a judge to do it. But I've also never gotten a judge I had one judge give me a rationale that the Nuremberg principles were not ratified, which is correct. U.S. Congress did not ratify the Nuremberg. Do you know what the Nuremberg? Let's talk a little bit about Nuremberg. So, what do you think I mean when I say Nuremberg?
Trial in Germany after World War II.
Okay, trials in Germany. Incidentally, when I was being arrested in Biel, Biel Air Base, none of the arresting officers in uniform, U.S. Air Force, knew what Nuremberg was. Even when I said, like World War II, end of World War II, they didn't know what it was. Why was Nuremberg important?
It held individuals accountable for.
Wait.
It made individuals responsible for their actions.
It made individuals responsible for their actions. For the actions of the state.
Right.
That was basically it.
Okay. Was that
They had to codify.
Do I hear any other? So there's a couple of things. One of the things is a little bit like the Keller-Brand Treaty that really changed things. Do you remember what? So we ended World War II. We were victors. There's this question of, okay, how do you make sure this doesn't happen again? Do you remember what Stalin's proposal was? Take the top 50,000 German leaders and execute them. I mean, top 50,000 German leaders and execute them.
That sounds like Stalin.
Good start.
Good start. Churchill thought that was excessive. He said we could probably do it with 5,000.
Such a reasonable.
Well, it's really interesting to understand because that was the concept at that time. It was radical to say, no, we could put these people in the court. It was so radical we had to have what we call the Nuremberg Charter. There's three things that are important in Nuremberg.
So how many people did we hang? 100, 130?
I don't know. We tried 1,600 in Germany. There's a charter, the judgment, and the principles. The charter, nobody done this before. The charter was what did a couple of things. One is it established that there would be a court. It established that, an interesting thing it established jurisdiction saying these crimes occur all over the place. It doesn't matter whether they occurred in Germany or one of the occupied countries. We're going to try them in this court. It says we're going to have a court. The accused are going to have a right to a defense. And a lot of them got off. They got lesser charges, and a lot of them were found innocent. So it set up the whole process. It also established the idea of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace were established by the Charter. And they did it saying this is basically the judgments, which are the judges' rulings. So this is treaty. This is court law, because this is what the courts found. And then the principles in 1950, the UN said to charge the International Criminal Law Committee, the International Law Committee, to go and look at the charter and look at the judgment and pull out of that the principles of law, of customary law that were established by these two. Make sense? Now, this was never ratified by the US. On the other hand, in 1950, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution saying that we accept the principles of law established by the Charter and the judgment as being customary law, passed unanimously by the General Assembly. basically, regardless of whether this was ratified or not, no nation has seriously challenged the question of whether the judgment, whether the principles of internet, whether the Nuremberg principles did represent customary law or not. And if they represent customary law, they apply, and they apply whether you sign any treaties or not, or enforce upon you whether you sign a treaty or not. So, it was a radical division. It also established the idea that, you know what I mean by superior order defense? In other words, I'm not guilty because I was just following orders.
Yeah.
They said, no, that doesn't work. Another common defense was, excuse me, I am the king. I not only am above the law, I am the law. You can't try me. And Nuremberg said, nah, that don't work anymore. We just got rid of that one. So Nuremberg did a lot of really important stuff. And the thing that's probably most important, at least most important for us, is it said the only way we're going to prosecute, the only way we're going to stop these war crimes and stop these wars is by making individuals responsible if they're complicit in a war crime. And part of what they said is, if you were involved in a war crime, you're complicit. Pay the taxes. And that is what, within 1 second, and that is what basically is the laws have said since then. Hey, if you can be prosecuted, if you can be prosecuted for not resisting the crime, you have sometimes a Nuremberg obligation, a Nuremberg privilege to resist that. And just before we get to you, Ramsey Clark sat in our court under oath and said, first of all, he said, yes, indeed, international law applies in this little do-it court. Yes, indeed, these people have a legal obligation to obstruct the commission of war crimes. First, he said, by any nonviolent means later, by any nonviolent means possible, and then he sort of hedged that and said, well, maybe even as long as the violence isn't greater than the crime. And he said that they have a legal obligation to obstruct it, and they have a legal right to resist it. And incidentally, we have the other First Amendment right to petition our government for redress of grievances.
What do you do with the problem that basically the Nuremberg trials were victors?
I love it. Thanks so much. Hey, does everybody want to sign up on this to get the handouts and stuff? Just put your email on here so I can sit down and email. I'm not giving it out in hard copy. I love it. I just wrote a piece on it. So, was the Nuremberg court a victor's court?
Yes.
Yes. Anybody here say no?
Hell yes.
No. Okay. So, let me just fill in for you. Why is it a victor's court? Well, first of all, it was a court by the victors. Period. Secondly, none of the U.S., French, or Russian war crimes were tried.
Obama Harris wasn't tried.
But on the other hand, these represented a radical change in international law. So one might take a broader perspective and say, the question isn't just exactly what happened in 1946. The question is, does this represent a victor's court or not? We have the Rwanda trials. We have are the Rwanda trials a victor's court? Are the Yugoslavia trials a victor's court? I don't know. Here's what I would propose to you. I would propose to you that whether or not Nuremberg was a victor's court depends on the future. If Nuremberg is used to prosecute war criminals broadly, then it's when that was not a victor's court. And you know what? Whether or not Nuremberg is used to prosecute war criminals broadly is up to us. It's up to us. If we make, and let me carry that one step further. We know that prosecution is typically domestic. if we start trying our war criminals like Cheney, I mean, the guy's a nut. And the American people hate him. I think he'd be a pretty good target. I think the people would, between Bush and Cheney, I think the American people would go along with trying to get him. What's that?
He's so evil looking, I mean, just everything about him, he's just this sneer and everything else, I mean,
I
there's
know.
nothing you can like about that guy.
Right, exactly. So I think that they're vulnerable targets in general. But my point being is if we start prosecuting our war criminals with international law in our courts, using the Nuremberg principles, it will not have benefit this court.
That's why it is a victim's court.
That's why it is a victim's court. It's because we aren't doing it. And I want to just go one step further. You know, I keep talking about democracy is us to make it happen. Nobody can give you rights. Nobody can give you a democracy. You have to take them. But you know, I fall into the trap too. I'm walking around here saying, "Oh yeah, International Criminal Court. I can't believe it. We signed on to it, and then Congress and didn't ratify it, and then Bush unsigned it, so we don't even sign on to it." And I just thought the other day, wait a minute, dude. What are you complaining about? You haven't done anything about it. Get off your dead ass and let's just change it. Let's just tell Congress, sign the damn thing. Make it a treaty. I'm just sitting here moping and complaining about it. I got off on a side note. Yes?
Could you unpack TPP as it relates to this?
What's that?
Could you talk more about TPP or the pivot as it relates to this?
Oh, well, I think that's just pretty straightforward militarism and imperialism, and you know, the pivot to the Pacific. And it's appalling. I mean, I'm going to tell you the whole Jeju issue with where we're trying to put in GS frigates there so we can run our anti-aircraft, anti-missile radars right off the coast is appalling. But I think I think that. So how does that apply to international law? Well, one way it applies to international law is it's clearly a case of aggression. Why would putting a GS missiles, GS frigates, which can run our anti-missile radar close to China where the missiles are slow, why would that be a act of aggression?
Because we could have first strike capability.
We could have first strike capability?
Because they couldn't respond.
Did you hear that? Say it again.
Because that allows us to, it enhances our capacity to do a first strike without getting a retaliatory strike back.
Do you want to explain that? Does everybody get that?
No.
I don't want to explain that.
I don't want to explain.
You're right. You're right. What we've done, so we have a balance here where we establish a balance where neither country, you know, that's why we have the Tridents, that's why we have the missiles underground, and so on. The whole idea, the whole balance is based on the fact of mutual assured destruction. Now, the idea was you attack us, we can before you can wipe out our system, we can wipe your whole country out. You can't have a first strike. But as soon as you break that balance, so that as soon as you design a system which is specifically designed to stop their retaliation, so you can do a first strike without being retaliated, that's an act of aggression. Because under international law, you don't have to commit the war of aggression. You only have to plan for it. That's a crime. Planning for a war of aggression is a crime under international law.
So the Russians setting up the military along the border of the Ukraine is an act of aggression. If it looks, you know, the purpose is that they're gonna invade. I mean, that's the reason they're there. If something happens they don't like, they're gonna invade them.
Well, I think that's an arguable point, but still, the question becomes if they are planning for an invasion of Ukraine. Now, there are some justifications for war, damn limited. I mean, under the UN Charter, there's two. clear and imminent threat of attack, clear and imminent. And if the Security Council said, okay, you really need to do this.
What about protecting the human rights of Russian speakers in East Ukraine who have been killed by the fascist Ukrainian regime?
You cannot use war crimes to
Without a UN order?
No, you can't use war crimes to in retribution for war crimes.
Then you go in to stop the war crimes.
You have a right, you have a responsibility to stop the war crimes, but then you have to see, do we have a respect to stop the war crimes? I'm not sure that you do have the right number. I'm not sure the state has the right to stop the war crimes.
Maybe you need a UN declaration to do that.
Well, what you do is you take it to court. I mean, the whole concept of this is to force, the whole concept of this is to force these decisions into a structure of law. That's what this was establishing international law as opposed to the law of the gun. And just as, yes?
You brought up with Nuremberg that one of the elements that came out of it was something that's related specifically with peace. I didn't quite get what, maybe you just used the word peace, but was there something that like we have a right to peace or something?
No, we
that
don't.
came out of Nuremberg?
Under things like the International Human Rights Law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we do. These are some of the things that are outlawed by international law. And I bring these up because it became very important to me after I was working in Gaza and in Israel, because I suddenly, I don't want to go on a whole thing.
15 minutes.
I was really angry. I should have been too. My point being is disproportionate force. What does that mean?
Kill ratio.
Is that?
Kill ratio?
Yeah, or on a more personal level, if he gets mad at me and throws a paper at me, that doesn't mean I can strangle him to death, right?
What Israel's doing to Gaza?
Because I don't get email.
Okay. Collective punishments. What's that? Ron's a real troublemaker. He threw a spitball at me. Everybody in this classroom is going to stay in this class for 2 weeks. I'm going. Or all day or whatever. It's not legal. And this is what I found so important. This is what I found so important. Is that you look like you have no.
No, yeah, where is this document from, Elliott?
This is I just wrote it the other day. Just wrote it recently. It's really I couldn't find a simple statement of this stuff. I'll give you a bunch of stuff though. I couldn't find a simple statement of this stuff. Look at these things. These are the things that really scream out. You can't take resources from an occupied land. I'm sorry, you go in there, you can't steal them. You can't destroying and removing cultural items. Remember when George Bush accepted from our soldiers the gold-plated pistol of Saddam Hussein?
Yeah.
It's a violation of international law. That was a violation of international
How
law.
about taking the resources of an occupied land, and we do that all over the world?
Oh no, we buy them. We buy them
By the government.
on a free market, right?
$1.
It's all free.
Displacing nationals. You can't go into a country and push them out. Just that's part of the war crime we had in Vietnam. We suddenly declared the whole damn area a free fire zone. I'm sorry, folks, you gotta leave because if you don't leave, we're going to consider you the enemy. Can't do that.
We teach collective punishments in high schools, though. I mean,
We
it's.
teach collective
That's
punishment.
right. That's part of what having.
It's American as apple pies.
Displacing nationals, you can't move a population into somebody else's land. Changing boundaries by force, you can't change cruel and unusual treatment, not only punishment, but also treatment. Human shields, indiscriminate weapons, targeting civilians. And one of the things I was realizing coming out of Gaza was that all those things which just scream out for retribution, scream out for vengeance, are illegal. And if we could take those things and help people say, okay, just like our court system, We don't think it's fair. But you know, there's some semblance that's gonna work out, and we let the court handle it. And if you knew that, okay, this kid was gonna go to court, and they were probably gonna find him guilty, and they were probably gonna punish him, then I wouldn't have to do it myself. I could say, damn, I got burned. It's not the same thing as it's not gonna make it right, it's not gonna make it good, but I can let it go. And you don't get this constant escalation as each person does something and the other side has to have a revenge. I came out recognizing this concept, and this would be a little bit of a choker for you. Every war crime is justifiable. Can you find fault with the Gazans for firing rockets into Israel?
I can't, and so I wonder, at this late date, what can we do to throw these facts as a monkey wrench into what we see unraveling from hour to hour?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
My son worked 4 times in Gaza with Dr. and Saran with the Committee for Human Rights. And yesterday he was telling me about colleagues that he worked with whose whole family was wiped out.
So I'm not quite sure what your question is.
My question is, what can we do in this present debacle in Gaza?
So let me see if this answers your question. I've come just not dealing with international law, but just dealing with Israel-Palestine. I believe that there will not be a resolution in the Israel-Palestine conflict until American foreign policy changes. And I believe American foreign policy will not change until we bring the American Jews on board with this.
The younger generation is coming on.
They're coming along, but we aren't working very hard at it.
You think if U.S. policy changed that would solve things in Israel-Palestine?
I didn't say that. What I said, it won't be solved until it changes.
Change things.
What's that?
Like change things. I don't think.
Well,
we
we give Israel 60.
$3.1 billion a year.
Stop giving Israel money and stop selling them weapons.
Just military aid.
I'm going to ask you this: $3.1 billion a year, right? If you were in Israel, Israel is a small country, and there's this big pipe, right? This great big pipe, and out of it's flowing $1.3 billion a year. There's roaring out of there. But of course, the only reason it's roaring out is because you got this conflict over here. Because you know damn well, if that conflict stopped, that pipe's going to get shut off. There's not going to be no money flowing out of it. Right?
So we go after the source.
Is that?
We go after the source, we attack the Federal Reserve, the ones that are giving them money.
Well, that's one approach. I would say that.
Not attack, only responsible.
I get you. I agree with you. I get you. I just want to say this. I have this thing I call the Cuba syndrome.
Yeah.
If you're a national politician running for national office, you know one thing. You know that 99% of Americans are opposed to the embargo of Cuba. But you also know that if you come out in favor of the embargo of Cuba, none of those people, or 99% of the people who are opposed to the embargo on Cuba, vote on that issue. That's not what they vote on. They vote on other things. On the other hand, you know that there are 30,000 expatriates in Miami who will vote on that issue. If you take them, you'll get Miami. If you get Miami, you'll probably get Orange County. If you get Orange County, Dade County runs wrong part of the state of the country. You'll get Dade County. If you get Dade County, you'll probably get Florida. That's why we have an embargo on Cuba. Same thing's true in Israel. Most of us don't vote on Israel-Palestine. 99% of the American public don't vote on Palestine, but generally the Jews do. And that's why.
And evangelicals.
What's that?
And evangelicals.
Well, there's various people. And
I'm just saying, you're assuming America runs everything. I think even if America stopped all governmental aid and stopped all weapons sales, that Israel could continue to operate the same general way. They get private contributions or make their own weapons. And they are prepared. I'm sure they have a contingency plan for if that happens. I'm just saying America doesn't run the world. We have a big influence in Israel, but without us, Israel's still gonna be Israel.
Well, there is money. There is the fact that we block every single resolution in the Security Council that
Well, that
blocks
international- that
Israel.
would have an effect.
There is the fact that we buy off the Egyptians with $3 billion a year. There is the fact that we are crimping Iran, pushing Iran because of Israel. There is the fact that we're trying to invade Syria because of Israel. We do a lot for Israel. I mean, I'm not saying to solve the problem. I can tell you what, it shortchanged the whistle. Change the whistle if you didn't have the money to change the whistle. If they suddenly found themselves, they didn't have this. I used to have a dog. I used to have a couple of dogs. I had this one little fox terrier. She was a little girl, one about that big. And she'd go trotting out there, some big dog, and she'd look over her shoulder to see if my golden retriever was with her. And if it was, she'd give that dog shit. If the golden wasn't behind her, she didn't do it.
Yeah.
She said, "Oh, okay, it's cool."
Israel just get China now.
What's that?
I said, they'll just get China. He's right.
Israel will get China?
They'll just get China, they'll get somebody else.
Yeah,
Well, that's an interesting one.
They already got China.
Well, at any rate, I think that we can go a long ways just by bringing the American Jews on board. And I think that most of the other efforts we try, we will not cut off aid until we bring the American Jews on board. We will not get America. We will continue to have people like John Kerry say, "America, hey, Israel's our best friend." I'm going to tell you something. With friends like Israel, nobody needs enemies.
That's right.
Yes.
A couple of points about Israel is that one, I read this article and one of the persons said, well, that's our landlocked aircraft carrier. So if anything happens in the Middle East, we got a place to land and take off. And secondly, they're big on R&D for the military, and we get an enormous amount of R&D equipment from, so even if we cut the money off, they'd be still doing R&D, and the corporation would be buying every damn thing they could, and the military would be buying everything. I mean, the drone came from there, some of the new weapon systems came from there. So, let's face it, they're a very bright industrial country, and we get a lot from them.
Sure is handy if you get an extra $3 billion and you have a
Well,
whole
there's
US
no doubt
military
about it,
behind
but
you.
eventually they get
And we're the
$30
only,
billion from
Israel is the only country that doesn't have to buy all their military things, use their money to buy military equipment from America. Only 80% comes back to the country. It's the only country that gets that kind of a break.
So I don't really want to get lost on the Israel-Palestine thing. I'm just giving you my take on it, and I may be wrong. But I think staying with the international law issue is the issue I want to stay on, and we've got to go.
What about civil resistance?
What's that? What about civil resistance?
I've intervened once, and you have said, the Jews, we must turn the tide.
Wait a minute, can you keep it quiet?
And to that, for everyone's knowledge, who doesn't know already, there is the Jewish Voice for Peace.
Yep.
Tune in there and see their arguments and see their passion and so on, and know who we have to work with.
So let's make it the last comment on Israel-Palestine. I didn't want to get so what was your question, Richard?
Well, one of the reasons I was here primarily is civil resistance, and you and I have had some experience at being arrested, and I've had sort of a mixed bag from the judges and juries, and you never know where it's coming out. I've had one judge say, well, now, if he really believes in what he did, and instruct the juries to take that into consideration. Now, if he really believed, by crossing the line, if he really believed for standing up behind or after the curfew, take that into consideration. So I've been dismissed on that. And then you've had other judges say, don't take any of this stuff into consideration. So there's such a mixed bag on civil resistance, hopefully based upon Nuremberg and all the rest. I don't know what to say about it.
I don't know whether this addresses what you're saying now, Richard, but as I told you, I've never gotten off on a international law defense. On the other hand, I do know one thing. If I quit trying, it'll never happen.
You're gonna get off on it, but you're gonna get reversals for other reasons.
You give them what?
Get reversals for other reasons.
Right.
But, you know, if you keep on pushing on that, the whole principle of international law, and other people are doing it too, I mean, it brings it to public consciousness.
That's right.
That's right.
And I've educated a lot of judges, I can guarantee you that. 1, 2, 3, go. 4.
Yes, thank you. For those who don't live in North Carolina, I would encourage you to look for the Moral Monday, do a search for that.
Yep.
Reverend Barber right here has really developed the fusion movement, and it's real, it's in real time. It's beyond the scope of what I can talk to here, but Moral Monday, look for that, lots of information. Yeah, yes, so, yeah, Moral Monday.
And you'll find Vicky in there, go ahead.
Okay, resource, if you're into this shit about war crimes, international law, United States Army Field Manual 27-10, the law of land warfare. It's a good basic primer and covers most of the key treaties and, you know, all that good shit. It's a nice place to start, and when somebody says, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, giving a public speech, I can whip that thing out, and then they don't know, they obviously don't know what they're talking about, because I got the book.
We also
It's
use.
a good tool, we'll use it.
We also use these citations in court because it establishes that the US military thinks it's. You had a question?
Connection with civil disobedience, I was told if you even raise your arm towards a police officer, that constitutes an aggression or a felony.
You have to
Pretty
touch
much,
it.
of course, all the laws, you know, the laws and all how they do it, but they can basically, if you do anything towards a cop, especially if you're in the country. It's like, so the rule is, I mean, there's a couple of rules. Never touch a cop, never do anything towards a cop, never argue with a judge. You know, he says, that's the rule, you say, okay, and then you just go ahead and try to do it again, but you don't disagree with it. Okay, thank you all. How many people want to work on this issue? International law. Get involved. Everybody get their email on here?
One of my ancestors were on the
Okay, he gets a point of the so he starts doing stuff like he's bringing